Hi friends, welcome to Beautifully Bookish Bethany, where I have new videos every week about books and the geeky mom lifestyle. In today's video, I'm joined by author Sara Faring. We're going to be walking around the West Village and talking about her newest book, White Fox. So stay tuned for some cool shots of New York City in the fall and some great information if you're looking for a spooky gothic read.
Hi everyone, I'm Sara Faring, and my most recent book is White Fox, which came out just in September 2020, and it opens on a mysterious Mediterranean island where a world-famous film star lives with her pharmaceutical tycoon husband and their two young daughters. One night, the film star disappears, and it's rumored she's left behind a final film script that could be the key to finding her. So 10 years later, her two daughters, who are now more or less estranged and living very different lives in Manhattan, return to the island for a retrospective honoring their mother's work, and they discover the film script. And this launches the most thrilling journey of their young lives as they unravel the mystery behind her disappearance. I'm really thrilled to be here. Love Bethany, so thank you for having me.
In both of your books, technology plays a really big role, and I think it's so interesting the way that you examine the intersection of technology and fear and what happens when maybe you go too far. It reminds me a little bit of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I feel like your books are kind of in conversation with that. Do you want to talk a little bit about why you write about that, what your thinking behind it is?
I've always been very interested in how technology affects our humanity from when I was a really young kid who discovered online chat rooms and felt like, you can be whoever you want on these and it can go to really dark places or not. And I was a bit of a demon child, so I definitely explored the boundaries when it comes to that. Especially with the popularity of social media right now, I've seen how this can kind of erode our sense of self, to fall down these spirals of social media and examining other people's lives and this sort of 2D reflection of their life that they create and put online. So for me, it's always been very interesting to explore that. In White Fox specifically, what I found interesting was this idea of basically losing your mother. She disappears when you're very young, and because she had this level of fame, you're basically given so many angles on who she was as a person from sources who don't know her at all but feel like they do because of the internet and social media and so on, people who knew her very well but just a piece of her. So for me, writing White Fox, it was sort of felt like this hall of mirrors where my two characters, these two girls, have to unravel who their mother was and kind of put together a narrative that works for them in their own lives based on all of these outside sources that are really not that reliable. It was also interesting for me to explore from the perspective of being a debut author last year, and before that, I basically had no social media at all. It was just not a way I kind of really wanted to connect with the world. I wasn't super interested in branding myself in that way, but obviously wanting to get my books out there, I felt like this was a real challenge. I had to take it seriously because it's such a great way to connect with new readers. One of my characters, Ty, she's the younger sister. She is an influencer, is very eager for any and all attention that she can get from the internet, which I completely understand, because the reality is, even though I'm more like her older sister Nani, who always has her head in the book and very much is not online, I absolutely understand how addictive it is and how thrilling it is to get this feedback from strangers all day long. So it was interesting for me to explore kind of this burgeoning social media brand I have as an author through Ty's character, as she kind of moves through the world as an influencer. And I like to play with that structurally too. So at the beginning of the book, you have Nani's point of view, and it's a straightforward narrative, starting from when she was 14 and in the West Village where we are right now. But it is a dual POV book, and we're only introduced to Ty first through her snippets of her social media feed. And it's almost as if she's feeding us little bits of her brand in order to kind of shape our perception of her before we've even heard her actual voice. The voice that we get as readers inside a character's head. I thought that was something that was kind of fun to play with too.
What's interesting too is I feel like you write these female characters who are messy. They're not perfect. Some might call them unlikable female characters, which, I have a soft spot in my heart for unlikable female characters.
So do I.
I think it's interesting to think about why they're considered unlikable and how misogyny plays a role in that.
Yes.
And I feel like that's something you seem to explore.
As far as White Fox goes, I think that, listen, every second that I'm out and about in the world, in public with other people, I'm acutely aware of the fact, that I'm female and I kind of inhabit this space as far as other people's perceptions go. I have to do certain things to keep myself safe in the city, and I have to, avoid certain blocks and do this and do that. So this book, White Fox, it's mostly set in a fictional island in the Mediterranean that's a very kind of closed environment, let's call it. It's where these girls grow up, it's where their parents raise them, it's where their mother disappears, and it's where they leave and they return 10 years later, not knowing how it's changed, how it's evolved, what's safe, what's unsafe, especially in light of the fact that their family is very well known, they're very well known. And I found it sort of fun for them to have this space where they could be amateur detectives unraveling what happened to their mother in a place that very well could be dangerous, but they have such a different attitude towards where that danger lies. For Nani, it very much comes from the perspective of they are young women in a place where their mother, something terrible might have happened to their mother, and that terrible thing might befall them too. And it doesn't matter if they're well known or not. They are young women living in this world, and that's just the reality. Whereas for her younger sister Tai, because she's an influencer, she has this feeling that she almost has this level of fame where she's kind of untouchable in her home country because so many people know who she is. The dangers to her are very different, in other words. Like, she's a little bit more concerned about how people will, in a broader way, will perceive her actions and how that will sort of affect her brand, but not so much like her day-to-day security, which I found kind of interesting, just on this island. Listen, I think that ultimately what I want to see on the page is examples of women who are sort of fascinated by and enamored by their contradictions. I want it to be easy for readers to say, okay, this character refuses to put herself in a tidy box, so I don't need to, maybe. That's really refreshing for me, because I feel like as we move throughout the world, we see examples of, we see role models, examples of people that we're like, okay, I'd love to follow in their footsteps, more or less. And because they've done it, I know how to approach this and how to do it successfully, despite, whatever preconception society might have about a person like me. For me to sort of expand that through writing characters who don't neatly fit into those boxes, I mean, that to me is an excellent part of writing fiction and reading fiction.
This is kind of the perfect time of year for your books. There's a lot of gothic feel to them, but with an updated sort of technological bent in some ways, which I think is interesting.
Yes.
Where do you draw inspiration for the atmospheric kind of gothic piece of your books?
I love that question. In a normal year, I love to travel, and I'm really drawn to sort of old, grand, sometimes almost decrepit homes, because I've always been obsessed with this kind of setting, this sort of gothic mansion setting, because I feel like to some degree our minds are gothic mansions that where some wings are falling apart, and maybe there's a new addition over here that you've worked really hard on, a part of your personality that you're like, I've really tried to grow and learn, and this is that brand new extension. And rooms that we're just sort of unwilling or uncomfortable looking in on. So for me, it's sort of the ideal setting, especially for a mystery, especially for anything that deals in kind of self-discovery, coming of age, family dynamics, because you're basically living a theme, living a really important theme. But really, you can find that kind of inspiration anywhere. I mean, right now we're next to Grove Court, which is this little enclave, almost like a muse. I've never actually gone into because it's gated and fenced, but you can peek in, and just things like that. I mean, it's so rife with inspiration for me. Any little detail like that I feel adds texture to this kind of book. I grew up in California, where I feel like you don't have quite as much of that necessarily, just by virtue of it not being as old. So let's say the cities and the structures that are still standing are not as old as a lot of the structures standing in New York City and on the East Coast. So I'm happy to live here now. A lot of this inspiration came from growing up. I would go to Argentina and visit my family, and there are just so many examples of really eerie old structures there that have these incredibly atmospheric environment, but also these stories baked into them, these histories that can be really dark and tragic, but are just fodder for, someone who likes to write these kinds of books.
What would you say are influences in terms of books that you've read or grew up reading that made you want to write spooky, atmospheric, mysterious books?
Well, this is very relevant right now, but Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, definitely a huge influence. And I know the Netflix movie just came out, which I have mixed feelings about, but as aesthetically gorgeous as it is. Shirley Jackson's books, always, far and away, going to name those as inspiring. If you haven't read Haunting of Hill House, you absolutely should, because I think she's good at kind of exploring through an eerie plot, those kind of hidden nooks in ourselves, and you kind of, every page that you read, it leaves you thinking about some part of your life or some part of yourself that you haven't really thought about in a while. And I that's just the ideal for me, the dream reading experience. The Westing Game by Ellen Rankin. Oh my gosh. So that was just one of those books that's so twisty and turns everything on its head toward the end. But it's also this sort of setting of there's a mysterious setting, there's a mysterious fortune, and it's being left to this group of strangers. I've always loved sort of conceits like that in books and movies. I mean, I was a really big fantasy reader when I was younger. I still love fantasy now, but I've been more and more drawn to what I would call weird books. So weird books that sort of have magic on the fringes as opposed to being in an entirely new world.
Yeah, and good ones you've read recently?
Oh my gosh. So I love Kevin Wilson's books, adult author. And he came out with a book recently called Nothing to See Here. And basically the idea behind it is there's this woman who's grew up poor and her life was basically sort of derailed because of a moment in high school that happened with her high school roommate. And her high school roommate is this very affluent woman who, a decade later, contacts her and needs her help because her new husband is the senator who's basically in line to be, the next president. He has 2 children who spontaneously combust. So they need a trusted housekeeper / nanny who will basically keep that information very close to the vest while taking care of these kids for this extremely affluent, out of touch with reality woman and her husband. So it's that kind of thing where there's something odd happening, but we're sort of kind of grounded in the real world. I mean, anything Kelly Link is going to fall into that category for sure.
Have you read Mexican Gothic?
I haven't read it. I have it in a stack in my apartment, and those books where you're like, I know I'm going to love this so much that I need it in print.
Yeah.
But because it's in print, I'll admit I'm one of those people who I read in the dark every night with a Kindle because I can just let it fall on my face while I'm sleeping, and the next morning I've rolled onto it. But if I have the light on, it keeps me up, the fact that I have to turn. And so no, I have not read it, but I feel like I'm gonna love it.
It's great. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So White Fox is interesting because it's written as a mixed media book, which I think is cool. What was that experience like writing it, and how did that kind of come together?
I've always loved mixed media books because I feel like it turns the reader into a detective as well. I wanted to save it for a book that I thought it worked really well with the themes in the book. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but just this idea that as the sisters move through the world and unravel the mystery of their mother's disappearance, they have to deal with all of these outside sources of varying degrees of reliability to add a layer of, all of these articles about what their mother was like and what they are supposed to be like. It was sort of a wink at the reader, there is definitely more than meets the eye, encouraging them to sort of read between the lines. I think that's always a bit fun as a reader and a writer. So,
what at this point is next for you?
Ooh, what's next for me? I'm actually really excited because I'm working on an adult book right now, which probably to readers won't come as a giant surprise. As much as I love YA, I have had these characters and this story in my head for a really long time. I can give you a tiny taste, even though I'm one of those people who feels like I'm jinxing myself if I mention a book I'm working on. But it's funny because it kind of almost elements remind me of the Westing Game in a weird way. It's 8 young strangers from around the world receive an invitation and it's to a game hosted by this infamous producer at his estate in Italy. And it occurs after this pandemic, although it's not about the pandemic at all. I'm acknowledging the reality of this year without it, laying too heavy on the narrative. They have no idea why they've been invited. They have no idea what connects them. They're being invited to this very strange and eerie game that they have to unravel as they move through the weekend. I very loosely base the structure on Decameron, so it's a bit of a frame story. It's been really challenging and very exciting because it is a bit of a pivot, and because I've been simmering it for so long, it has all of these extra layers, and I feel like if you work on a book like that over a long period of time, you can hold all those layers in your head. Whereas the process of getting White Fox together, so White Fox incorporates bits of the first book I ever wrote, but it is essentially a new book. So to put that together after my debut and have it come out, a year after my debut released, was very challenging in a different way.
I mean, that sounds really interesting. Your books certainly crossovers, I would say.
I think
you're
so.
a little older, and so that's not, I think that's exciting.